home with weapons we can't see because the last veterans came home with weapons we couldn't see. It's ironic that as we debate providing victims of the last chemical warfare just compensation, we now find ourselves with the prospect of sending more men and more women to their same fate. That, too, is something about which I will have more to say at a later date and another time. But let me reiterate, this nation owes these men and women our strongest commitment during and after they go to war. Just as we expect that they must give their very best should they go to war, so must we now commit to doing our very best before that war. And it is this concern which has led me to come to the conclusions I have. The question is, before we commit to war, has this government done its very best? If we're going to ask them to do their best, have we done our best before we say, now is the time? To that simple question, there's a complicated answer. Yes, the President has done his best in involving the world community, in joining us in the effort. And I use the word joining because I view joining and participating as two different things. While our coalition partners have joined the United States in its effort, many have yet to effectively participate. Yes, this country has done its best in coordinating the embargo, perhaps the most effective embargo in modern history. But have we done our best in other respects? I believe that we have yet to do our best in determining the success of that embargo. Who among us can say with any confidence that the embargo will fail? And if we can't say that, how is it even possible to consider the loss of one American life before we assure that the young men and women who may lose their lives, that we have done our best to ensure the success of this option before we resort to war? We've also not done our best when it comes to diplomacy. 6 hours of talk with Iraqis after 6 months of confrontation is not doing our best. To say we won't talk on this or that day, we won't travel to this or that city, that's not doing our best. Nor is it doing our best to set artificial deadlines. No one has yet explained the significance of January 15th. What is it about that date that's worth one American life? What do we tell families of those who may lose their lives on January 16th, but whose lives could have been saved had we waited until April or July or October? And if we can save American life by waiting until another date, yet still succeed in removing the Iraqis from Kuwait, isn't that worth a life to do? And at some point, we've even got to ask ourselves, have we done our best in financing this conflict? Financing. Have we succeeded? Have we done our best in obtaining the financial assistance from others? And to the degree we failed, we must ask ourselves, how is it that we intend to pay for our presence there? Certainly, we shouldn't be relegated to borrowing the resources for a cause so worthy that we are now prepared to send our best into combat. And if we demand from them the courage to fight, then we ought to demonstrate the courage to find the means to pay. Well, therefore, Mr. President, one must ask, can we really look these young men and women in the eye and say, yes, we've done our best. We've done our best diplomatically. We've done our best economically. Therefore, now we ask you to do your best in war. The President must think so. Many of my colleagues do so too. But I have concluded that we have not. Nor do I have the confidence that we in the Congress in particular have done our best to address these concerns prior to committing our families to war. So today, tomorrow, and for the foreseeable future, I can only insist that we do so. That we consider every diplomatic option available to us and to others. That we enforce the embargo and monitor its success. That we determine that success before we commit to war. And that before we commit to war, we ensure that all of our coalition partners commit their people too. And above all, Mr. President, let us be convinced, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that our purposes and our goals adequately demand the loss of American life. Only then, Mr. President, will we have done our best. Only then are we prepared for war. I yield the floor. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Adams. Mr. Akaka. Mr. Balkos.
Well, a long day's journey of congressional debate, well into the evening, now coming to a close, in the Senate at least. We've had approximately 10 hours of debate by the Senate. The House also began its first debate on Persian Gulf policy. This is the first step toward congressional action on resolutions to express a congressional position on the conflict and the course which America should be taking. Norm Ornstein of the American Enterprise Institute and Stephen Roberts of U.S. News and World Report have been patiently sitting here lo this long day with me watching the proceedings. And what have we learned today, gentlemen?
Well, I think one thing we've learned is that the vote in the Senate is likely to be much closer and much more uncomfortable for the president than he thought. Most of the speakers have been Democrats who have criticized the president quite severely. A number of potential converts to the president's side, moderate conservative Democrats who often back the president on matters of national security, have lined up against him. And a very important moment late this evening, Paul, Senator Dole, the Republican leader, came out and raised the possibility that Republicans might stage a filibuster rather than allow this resolution to come to a vote in the Senate, indicating that his private vote counts show that he's probably in trouble. And that's one of the most significant and surprising things we've learned in the last few hours.
You know, Senator Dole, at an early stage, Paul, had predicted about a 60-40 vote in favor of the president in the Senate. Clearly, the votes don't suggest that now. I think it's fairly close. We were toting up the likely votes based on the people who talked today in the Senate and what we know of others earlier today, and it seemed to be quite close. There are 44 Republicans in the Senate, and we didn't have many of them talk today. But basically, we already know that there are probably going to be a couple who will vote against the president this time, and that's going to mean that they've got to get 8 or 9 Democrats. We had very few Democrats come to the floor today who indicated even a bit of sympathy with that position. We had none who came right out for it. There were some who went to visit the president at the White House today, Bennett Johnston of Louisiana, Chuck Robb of Virginia, who indicated that they would back the president. But it may be difficult, particularly since we know that some of the more conservative members, David Boren, who spoke just a few minutes ago, quite emotionally, indicating that he would not back up the president for the use of force right now, won't be with him. It's going to be very interesting in the Senate. In the House, which broke up a little bit earlier, which now is in what they call special orders, they've taken care of their debate, moved with much more precision, and there seems to be, quite interestingly, more support for the president there on a bipartisan basis.
But on the whole, we'd have to say this comes as a surprise because it's just a day after the failure of the Geneva meeting, and I think there was a sense as the day began that there might be support solidifying more in the president's favor on Capitol Hill.
Well, that seems to have happened in the House, but not necessarily in the Senate. And we're not predicting the outcome here, Paul. That would be wrong to say that. But our indications clearly are that this is very close, and I think we have some indications of why. Speaker after speaker, some quite emotional, Paul, talked about, could I justify sending my own children to war? And saying, no, I could not. Senator Daschle, Senator Boren making this point, and saying, if I couldn't justify it in terms of my own children, how could I justify it in terms of my constituents? That reveals, Paul, a very basic division in this country and a very basic core of opposition to going to war. That doesn't the polls show that a majority supports the president, but as we said many times, there's a very strong core of opposition, and it certainly was visible on the floor of the Senate tonight.
And I think in a very real sense today, the debate which we heard in both the House and the Senate did reflect the country's own deepening concern about the prospect of war.
I think there's no question about it. The country is to some degree divided. Most of our surveys suggest that a majority of Americans would favor the use of force. A Times Mirror survey says 51% would favor the use of force very swiftly once the January 15th deadline passes. About 75% in most surveys suggest that at some point, an hour or later, the use of force would be justified. But there are a lot of misgivings about that out in the public, and they're reflected, although the misgivings more reflected clearly in the Senate. Remember, too, though, Paul, that events will occur in the next couple of days that may finally shape the outcome of these votes.
Well, this winds up our PBS coverage of today's opening round of congressional debate over Persian Gulf policy. Both the House and Senate will be resuming their sessions tomorrow, and so will we at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. I'm Paul Duke with Stephen Roberts and Norman Ornstein in Washington.
Funding for this program was made possible by the financial support of viewers like you.
This is PBS.